Good morning and welcome to Old St Andrews, Montrose for the sermon for Sunday the 27th of March, the fourth Sunday in Lent, based on the passage from Luke 15, the lost son. A fresh look. Mothers and fathers. There is the old story of a young person in their early 20s who, having returned home after having spent most of the past few years away at college, remarked to their friends, "Isn't it amazing how much our parents have learned in the last 3 years? They seem to understand so much more than they ever did before." Of course, the boot was rather on the other foot. Their parents hadn't changed much, but they had. And often the greatest change is in our ability to appreciate others and the way that they think, even when that thinking is very different from ours. As an aside, that's a quality that is sorely needed just now, not least among our world leaders. Like most parents, I'm proud of my children, but it's been hugely gratifying to see them grow in their understanding and experience as adults. Last year on Mother's Day, Laura was a mum of a rather large bump. This year, to a 12-month-old daughter. She is still my little girl, but it's been wonderful to see her take so well to being a mum to Lucy, who incidentally is going to be spoilt rotten by her Uncle Gavin. I have to look at them with fresh eyes because they're no longer children. Yet they're still the kids that Elaine and I brought up. I'm sometimes a bit slower on the uptake when it comes to really understanding, so let me add that it's amazing how much my mum has learned over the last 50 years or so. Of course, these experiences of growing understanding of other human beings are not confined to mothers or fathers or indeed family relationships. If we're open, they can be extended to an appreciation of friends, neighbours, work colleagues, others in the church, indeed our appreciation of others in general, the way that they think, often different to us, their priorities, their goals, their ambitions, their sensitivities. But equally, as many a report card will have stated, we could do better. And to begin any improvement, we may well need to take a fresh look at ourselves. The lost son, afresh. It did strike me as odd that on Mother's Day we focus on a passage that involves a father's dealing with his sons. I always presumed that their wife/mum had died, and you wonder if things might have been very different in that family had she still been around. One commentator suggested that we could easily change it to mother and daughters, as gender isn't really an issue here. Well, maybe it isn't, but I have a sneaky suspicion that they would have handled things rather differently, which is not to say that girls can't up sticks and rebel, nor that they can't be jealous of one another. Let's take it as it's written for the moment, but try to see it through fresh eyes. Let's face it, most of us here will have heard the parable of the lost son or prodigal son umpteen times. Is there possibly anything new that we could learn from it? Well, perhaps not if we simply go over the same ground. But let's try a slightly different tack. What does the story say to you? Forget for the moment, if you can, all the lessons you've learned about love and forgiveness. Did I really say that? Well, temporarily anyway. Lay aside the moralising and the religious lessons that have been drawn from this parable, and let's be honest about our reaction to the story and to the boys. First of all, the boy who left. What do you think of the boy who left? Honestly, if you were to write him a letter, what would you say? Would you secretly have been jealous of his freedom, of his living it up in luxury? Would you have asked him about what he thought of his wild times? Or would you be critical of his wasted opportunities and how he squandered so much of his inheritance that could have been put to better use? Or would you have been more sensitive to him in his squalor, more concerned at his hunger and loneliness? And what of your reaction to his return? Pleased that he'd come to his senses? Rather annoyed at the OTT welcome from his father? Perhaps a feeling that he got off lightly? Or possibly an expression of relief that relations were much improved? Or maybe some other thoughts that I haven't mentioned. It's up to you. And we'll have different ideas, perhaps along a spectrum of reaction, perhaps even a bit of a hodgepodge of differing responses. And it could just be that some of those will be affected by the degree to which deep down we might have felt affinity with the boy who rebelled, the boy who left. Okay, let's leave our thoughts on that boy and turn to the other one, the boy who stayed. So, what would you write in a letter to the other boy, the one who stayed with his father? How much affinity do you have with him? It would be surprising if there wasn't some sympathy for him, given that we put a lot of store on loyalty, on hard work, commitment, and dedication. Would you tell him that you understand his grievances? Appreciate the unfairness of the OTT welcome his father had given his brother, and the sense of injustice that he feels for reward for riotous living? Would you sympathise with him at the seeming lack of gratitude for his diligence and hard work at home, while his brother had been away, wasteful in living it up? Traditionally, the finger would have been pointed at him. His self-righteousness and pride would have been highlighted as failings. But we'd not likely not focus too much on that, because if truth be told, many of us would have had more in common with him. Through fresh eyes. Sometimes we overcomplicate stories in the Bible. Sometimes we simplify them so much that we totally remove much of their purpose. The fact is, we can't and we shouldn't forget the lessons we've gained from parables such as this. And yes, in many ways it's much more to do with the father's attitude than the boy's. There's nothing wrong with emphasising the overwhelming love of the father to his erstwhile lost son, whom he thought was dead. After all, he would presumably have reacted in the same way had the older brother been the one to leave home and return. There are definitely lessons to be learned about the generous extent, the undeserved nature of forgiveness from this welcome. But so too, there are lessons for us about the dangers of pride and self-satisfaction, of failing to take into account others' needs and outlook, perhaps taking others, and maybe especially good friends or family members, for granted. And no doubt there's much more to be had too. But the main thing is that Jesus told parables to make us think and to get us to change. Yes, in some parables it's glaringly obvious that there is a key lesson. So, for example, in the parable of the lost sheep, there's an overwhelming thrust outwards. God cares for the lost, not just those in the pen, pointing us undoubtedly towards his missional imperative. We are to go out, seeking to love those who are beyond the walls of our church buildings, out into the community and into the world, to love others for his sake. But in some parables, and I think this is one of them, there isn't just one lesson, there are many. And we need to listen carefully to the story and to what God might be saying to us and act upon it. Let me personalise that and say the same thing with a slightly different emphasis. We need to listen carefully to the story and to what God is saying to us and act upon it. Because, as with a wise parent, God knows the needs of each and every one of his children, and while he loves us equally, he will treat us slightly differently to give us what we need to respond to his love and to grow in that love. I didn't ask you, would you have been the one to stay or the one to leave? I suspect that many of us, including me, would have had a leaning to stay, but perhaps too there would have been a part of us that were just a bit jealous of the grass on the other side. But I'm not pushing you into either camp. I'm rather suggesting that Jesus wanted his hearers then and now to listen to this story, to explore our attitudes, especially how we relate to others, how we cope with different outlooks and priorities held by others, and how we begin to relate better to them. And maybe we should begin not with international leaders with whom we'd like to give a piece of our mind, though I'm sure we'd learn a lot about ourselves were we to do that, but with an exploration of attitudes to others who live much nearer home. Can you view them through fresh eyes? Would the lens of this parable, with its mixture of waywardness, searching, loss, pride, forgiveness, and self-righteousness, would that help? The parable doesn't actually tell us how the boys got on. Presumably this was something that they and their father would have to work on way beyond the celebratory party. So on this Mother's Day, while giving thanks for the love and care that many of us received from the lady who gave birth to us, or from some other dear soul or souls, female or male, who contributed to our upbringing and development, let us be open to follow Jesus' prompting so that we might learn to love and care, welcome and embrace, forgive and be forgiven, not just by siblings, parents, or other relatives, but by our sisters and brothers in the church, and those in the community and in the world, in the family of the whole human race. May the Lord bless you. Amen.